All right. Hello and welcome to this Information Week session on bridging the divide between cloud and networking teams. My name is Dana Skoldsky. I'm the Senior Corporate Communications Manager here at Blue Cat, and I'm joined today by our Spotlight presenter and Chief Strategy Officer of Blue Cat, Andrew Wortkin. Andrew, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
If you're in the session, it's probably because you've got a good sense that there's some misalignment happening within your organization and that it is impacting your cloud adoption success. We're here to tell you that there probably is misalignment and that it probably is impacting your cloud adoption success. But more importantly, we're here to share with you some tools and advice meant to help you make real change within your organization and spark movement on that front, regardless if you're an executive or you find yourself in one of these camps that we call the cloud or the networking team. Before we get into it, Andrew, maybe we should explain why a DNS, DHCP, and IP address software vendor is talking about collaboration in the cloud.
Well, it's actually, we work very closely with our customers, and it's been a very interesting journey the last few years, working with a lot of our large strategic and smaller customers out there, watching and trying to help with the struggle of cloud adoption and cloud migration, and seeing the same common patterns, like something going wrong in that other domain, and for instance that DDI administrator who might be part of the IT centric network team not really being involved in the conversation and really trying to push and provide guidance and to get the conversation going more in a more collaborative way. They seem to not be part of that conversation, which led to issues and would always lead to issues. And we're seeing that change over time. And some of our customers are on like architecture number 3 or 4 of how they're doing cloud networking, which is, they're finally, and now when we meet with them, there's a joint team of experts and practitioners across the different organizations, really looking at this holistically as opposed to completely separately. And so one of the reasons we contacted EMA was to do some primary research around what we've just been seeing all over the place, so that we can start trying to develop some recommendations as well.
Right. It feels like everybody's got stories to the effect of, we need to integrate and here's why. But it's often hard to mobilize change, especially if you can't quantify the impacts of something like this,
Right.
or you can't sell up or across. So we did reach out to EMA and they were on board right away. They had seen this happening as well. And so they were, I think, quite excited to work with us as well to figure out, okay, well, what are the impacts of misalignment across teams that we think are really important to a cloud adoption, which are the networking and the cloud teams. Andrew, before we get into some of the numbers that come out of this research, for everyone here who's going to hear us talking about the network team and the cloud team and cloud adoption, I think it's probably best for us to do some level setting on what we mean by those terms. There's different definitions depending on who you ask. So just what do they mean in the context of this conversation?
Yeah, and so when we mentioned the the network team, for instance, we're generally talking about the team that's normally part of the centralized IT organization that has been stewarding, architecting, engineering, and operating the network for years, depending on how long the company's been around. And when we talk about the cloud team generally, we're talking about, in many cases, teams that evolved outside of central IT, maybe part of the line of business, might have started as shadow IT or not, but are usually outside of the organization of that centralized IT team that are pushing forward on cloud deployment, cloud application development, cloud migration, whatever the case might be. Again, usually much more aligned to a business outside of IT.
Thank you for that, Andrew. And going back to what EMA found, there's some interesting numbers that you should know and probably keep in your back pocket when you're having conversations in and around this topic. This research study was led by their VP of Research, Seamus McGillicuddy, who specifically focuses on network management as a practice. He surveyed 212 network and cloud professionals, so you have both sides of this, and found that only 28% of them could say that their organization was fully successful at realizing the full benefits of the cloud. This was at organizations who had at least 2,500 employees, so this is not a small scale issue. But Andrew, perhaps you could talk a little bit more about the context of cloud adoption today and what enterprises are looking for and what's at stake with them when we say that only 28% can admit full success.
Yeah, no, you know, right. So that what is the definition of success? You know, in some cases, customers of ours, others out there have had very public, like, you know, 80% of workloads will be migrated by 2024 or something like that. So sometimes it's metered around time or, you know, some percentage of workloads. In other cases, when you're talking success, it's around launch of new applications and services. And so the cloud adoption was part of a digital transformation strategy, for instance, that is leading to some next generation applications for, you know, some sort of customer engagement, whatever the case might be. And problems in you know, cloud adoption in general is what slowed down or made that process miss, or that application was late, or whatever the case might be. So it depends on the organization and what their objectives were in the first place. But still, like you look at you know, a number lower than 30%, and it's not. I think it's probably, you know, for our audience, you know, I think it's probably not surprising, because there's always been a lot of overpromise and hype. The cloud represents an amazing opportunity to innovate faster, and with tools and capabilities and platform services to create things. You know, lowers the barrier of entry for many companies. Like, there's so much goodness about what goes on there. But part of the overinflated promise is, okay, we used to be slow. We'll do stuff here. It'll be fast, and you know, it's not that easy, you know, and especially when you go to scale stuff. And so so it didn't surprise me, but it was interesting to see.
It's definitely not a surprising number, and I think a lot of people in our community have expressed the same reaction. But surprising does not mean not surprising does not mean insignificant.
Oh yeah, not at all, right? I mean, this is a core problem. There's billions and billions of dollars being spent on you know, with the cloud providers, on the actual, for tools and processes and people, and the actual process of moving stuff to the cloud. This isn't a tire kicking event, and so you know, the lack of a lot of organizational success here really flies in the face of the promise of how to get there. You know, I think the good news, and we'll get into some of it. I mean, it certainly over the last 5, 6, 7 years, we've seen changes and more success. But this survey is recent, so I don't know what the numbers would have been a few years ago.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I mean, to bring it home, when we talk about only 28% agreeing that they're successful, there's things to learn from there, and the industry is definitely moving there. Um, from that success perspective, and this is really important to note, the people who admitted to being very successful were twice as likely to admit that there was integration between their cloud and networking teams on the design front, on the engineering front, on the operations front. That's important, and that shows the value here of putting work into integrating these teams at a better level. That doesn't mean joining them at the hip together in all senses and everywhere, but there are some best practices around that. Before we get into them, I think, Andrew, sometimes it's easier to explain the value of moving towards a certain initiative when you show what happens when things aren't working. And there were some questions in the survey asked of cloud and networking professionals around, you know, what happens when there are collaboration challenges between your cloud and networking teams. I thought some of the stats there were pretty concerning. and pretty useful for those of you looking to start conversations around this in your organizations. Perhaps you could take us through those and walk us through how they play out on the ground.
No, for sure. I mean, I think the the EMA broke these down into three core areas. One being security and compliance, one being around IT ops, and one being sort of generalized business issues. And when you look at like I don't know, Dana, what was it, 73% or so responded with core security issues and compliance issues, and in follow-up conversations and some of the survey data, like those broke down into things like uh, data leaks, um, the application inavailability, compliance issues. There were companies that actually reported to us that they were fined and publicly fined for some of those compliance issues. So they were pretty severe. It was interesting. EMA was saying that one of the respondents in a follow-up conversation said, they were actually, and they were from that sort of network team, and it was I think a PCI related migration, and they were brought in to consult with the cloud team to begin with. They went through the requirements. That person was then, went back to do their normal job, and nothing got implemented, and they pulled them in afterwards to try to fix it as well. And so it was one of those examples of, okay, so there was a lightweight collaboration there, but that wasn't taken to the end, and I think that's what we mean by like it's when just going back to that idea that 28% were very successful. That doesn't mean that a much higher percentage of companies don't have real successes to report. Obviously, there's a lot of real successes out there in industry. This is more about the general view, and so but these things like compliance or security issues or data leaks, whatever, are avoidable. And you get the sense when you hear these stories of companies sort of learning from their own mistakes, and that often happens in new paradigms. And so it's not surprising to hear. And that was on the security side. On the IT ops side, it was application performance, application availability. That's where a lot of really interesting stress came out around frequency of change. So a lot of frustration on the IT ops side between the immediate need of one team versus the ability for the other team to meet that same frequency of change. And we hear this often, right? I mean, the cloud's about being able to change things really fast, and we can be agile, and we can just deploy, make changes, make changes, make changes. And there's this assumption that, okay, well, now that these networks out there are all routed to our data centers or campus and branches, or however it's actually built, that those changes can be made just as rapidly on the other side. And by the way, there's no reason they can't be, as long as the company is invested in the abilities to do that. But that's also where you start feeling some of the personality conflict sometimes between these teams, where the cloud team, especially in the early days, like the shadow IT team days, might think that their purpose, the reason they exist, is because IT is too slow, so they're going to build this stuff faster, and these become almost proof points, as opposed to missed opportunities for collaboration up front, because again, it is possible, and certainly processes and technology can be implemented so that changes can be made appropriately on both sides of the fence, as long as the architecture has been, those goals are defined as part of what's implemented. If we just invest everything in the cloud and we're not getting the rest of the network ready for it, then that's not going to happen easily. And so it comes down to a lack of collaboration up front. But the IT ops issues weren't a surprise. And in fact, I remember one of our customers, the network team, saying to me, they're not listening, and so we're going to stop talking, and they're just going to fail, and maybe then they'll come talk to us. And just walking away from that meeting thinking, that I can't imagine that level of dysfunction where it's okay for the company to fail because they're not listening to me. And I think it really represents a lack of alignment higher up in the organization, that individual practitioners sort of have that view.
Right. And this doesn't just confine itself to security or operations issues. This has direct impact on the business.
Yeah, right. And that was and something like 80% said they had these broader business views. And those were everything from internal customers not being able to do their jobs. In other words, performance of applications became so poor when moved that they hit productivity. Like there was a lower worker productivity. External customers as well. Companies or sorry, respondents talked about customer loyalty issues, customer churn issues, and then also their own staff, like people leaving the company because of these dysfunctions, and their assumption that there must be, like, why do I have to deal with this? There's got to be a job where I don't have to deal with such a dysfunctional organization. And so you had smart people leaving, customer issues both internally and externally, and then also, like, revenue loss and cost overruns, and so in many cases the cloud or digitization or digital transformation in general is the application of technology core to the company's strategy, as opposed to perhaps back end systems or whatever the case. But this is like, right there in terms of how we're going to go to market, how we're going to touch our customers, how we're going to collect data necessary to drive strategies. It's right there. And so misses in these opportunities are usually closer to misses in company revenue targets, for instance, or cost targets.
Thank you for that. And for everybody watching, if you're looking for more details on any of these statistics, you can download the full research report in the Information Week events content download section or at bluecatnetworks.com/informationweek. Andrew, before we get into talking about, okay, well, what were the best practices that EMA teased out? What are the recommendations here? Talk to me a little bit about, okay, when we say collaboration, what do we mean by this? Is this a people issue, purely a people issue, technology, both? And what are your thoughts on that? What have you seen work?
Yeah, like with most things, it's everything. Well, it's people, it's processes, it's technology, and the stories, the anecdotes that get out there tend to be mostly focused on people, because you've got two different teams that sort of like what you'd hear about the networks and security teams in the past, but you have two different teams that feel like they have a different mandate, and I'm not saying it gets personal, but it gets, there's friction in the relationship, and the friction exists with, comes with this idea that both teams are sort of oversimplifying the other team or disregarding their experience or what they're trying to do, and hopefully we're starting to get beyond that. But there are people issues and skill set issues, and from a technology side as well. There's the rapid adoption of cloud. Brings in the rapid adoption of technologies that company doesn't have history with, and also the potential of splintering solutions that are used internally and on the cloud, and so for sure there's technology issues as well, and a lot of that just comes down to process, which we talked about too, in terms of like change process and speed of process and expectations of process. So yeah, it was across everything, and but not, again, not a minor, in a minor way. Like, it was significant collaboration issues that were discussed.
Beautiful, thank you. And to end on a positive, productive note, EMA did leave some really good recommendations in the research report for you to look at. I think there's a lot of overlap here between what we were seeing and what we were recommending, and what they found, which is really validating to hear. But Andrew, let's share what those are with the people watching, so that they can take this back with them to their organizations, no matter the size, no matter who they are, within their teams, so that they can start making a difference here.
Yeah, no, and Dana, like as you said, I mean, it's we do see a lot of success out there as well, and so some of these the recommendations were validating to some extent because this is in many ways what we see, but the first is that alignment needs to happen like almost at the C level, like if the business line general managers or the CTO is driving a lot of the cloud strategy, and the CIO, his or her peer, there's no alignment there. They're not working together. Then that immediately gets reflected down to the VP and director level and individual practitioner level. So that alignment needs to start way up top. Like there has to be a company strategy that is bought into by the leaders of these different organizations to get to the end game. Otherwise, the friction just rolls downhill.
Wonderful. And in terms of specific institutional knowledge sets or teams that often get left out of these conversations, who do you recommend as adding to the conversation and with priority?
And look, I mean, I think let's just make this about the network because that's what we're talking about. But I think it is critical to get enterprise architects, network architects. Like the architecture level is in many cases where collaboration is most critical. And it's critical in engineering, it's critical in operations, and there needs to be a lot of collaboration there. But in my mind, architecture means planning and means encapsulating the business requirements in a way where solutions can be created. I can't engineer something if I don't understand the requirements and the architecture. And it's critical there that, instead of being a stakeholder who's questioned or brought in for his or her expertise at a moment in time, that those stakeholders from that networking team are virtually part of the team that's defining that architecture. And again, that's what we see just with meetings with our customers, where it used to be just with one team. Now it's with both teams, and you can tell that this isn't the first time they're meeting each other like the first couple meetings. Like they're working with each other and they've got some questions. Here are 2 or 3 different architectures they're thinking about versus here's how we did it. We don't know why they did it that way and it's broken. And so it's got to start up front, but it's got to be a permanent seat at that table as opposed to a consulting role. Otherwise, here's what's happened. Here's what will happen. So much gets decided. You reach out to some expert in the networking team to ask them a question like, what's better, A or B? There's no context there. You've made 8 decisions before you ask them a question. And so they'll tell you if A or B is better, but even better than that is maybe neither A or B is better based on what the original requirement was. And if they're not in that conversation, they don't have any of that context, they're not going to, you're not using the expertise in a way that is most scalable. It's same thing on the other side, by the way. And my word, have we seen the downside of not making those with just insane routing of network packets between 2 different accounts in one cloud, versus, other clouds, and just like basically if somebody wanted to design something so that there was the longest path in every route, this is how they would do it. And obviously these weren't done purposely, but you just sort of go, well, why'd you do it that way? Why, so it's just, up front.
Yeah, and then you wonder why there are performance issues and cost
Right.
issues. But nevertheless, there are 2 more recommendations for us to get through and just a little bit of time left. Andrew, when it comes to unifying certain key things, and we've seen for a while how networking and security are converging, but what's important on the cloud networking side, and also what kinds of skills are most important to have stocked up when you're thinking about, say, a cloud center of excellence and how you staff that?
Yeah, no. So, I mean, again, you need skills from both, and we think about like the unification of technology. And I want to be very careful not to suggest that the answer is taking the same technology that we've been using on premises forever and just force fitting that into the cloud. That doesn't work. There's different solutions in different domains that make sense. You need to look at the things that create and enable the connectivity, the things that need to be common and should be common. It is, part of the cloud, since things are supposedly easy to change. And by the way, you can create a mess really quickly that isn't easy to change, but you end up also with tool propagation. There's always a different way to do something, and you might have different teams let them use whatever they want. That's part of the tenets of agile, whatever. You end up creating more chaos with that. And so I think there's a consistency in tooling that is important. And in many cases that what the cloud teams start using for deployment, I don't know, whatever, they're using Terraform, let's say, for deployments, doesn't really matter. Well, there's no reason that can't be used for some on-premises stuff too. So start using the same tools where you can to drive some level of commonality. In many cases, it's the API that is the communication mechanism between these teams. When things are working really well, there's no change request. The cloud team is orchestrating a deployment of an application, which is going to require this change to routing that's controlled by this other team. Just let them do it via API. Make sure that they can get their job done across where they need to. And again, that requires some level of planning, but consistency in processes and tooling and stuff like that becomes very important too. Most importantly for things like, obviously this is Blue Cat serving, but like things like, IP space and IP space allotment, very, very important.
Wonderful, thank you. Is there anything else that you would want to add before we get to closing this presentation out?
No, look, I think it's funny. At Blue Cat, we did a pretty large cloud migration or cloud adoption as we started producing, beyond our core on-premises appliance-based applications, SaaS-based applications, and it was funny to see, even in the size of our organization of 400 people or so, some of these same issues happened between my team at the time and our IT team at the time, and with no personality issues at all, but just wait a second, you're not allowed to change that. We're not giving you an API to that stuff. And in that case, the stuff they weren't giving us an API to was Blue Cat stuff because we use our own products here. And so it was like the same sort of thing here. And so again, we see it over and over again. And I just want to close with saying a couple things. One is, I'm always fearful of, there's lots of companies that have a solution for whatever you're having problem with, and it just actually layers on another more complexity on top of it. Technology can't be the answer on its own. It's got to be people and process as well. And I think there's a lot of underutilization of things that people have today. You don't have to do things differently unless there's a requirement to do them differently. That all goes back into the initial planning. And so, concentrate on architecture.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it feels like it's more tangible and actionable to pick up a new technology and think it's going to solve everything. But I think that dedicated focus on people, on process is important to be able to justify within your organization and then to actually act on. So with that, I'd like to say to everybody watching, thank you so much for tuning into this session. We hope that you got something out of it. You pocketed either a conversation point that you can bring up with your teams, or a tactic or a strategy that you want to bring into your organization. If you're looking for references on any of the stuff we talked about around the research and possibly some other additional info, check out the Information Week content download section, or visit us at bluecatnetworks.com/informationweek. With that, I'd like to say thank you so much for watching and have a fantastic rest of your day.